Welcome back. This is Dr. Richard Venditti. And we're going to be talking about the importance of the bioeconomy. We're going to be talking about outputs of society. Our learning objectives. What we're going to first try to understand is what are the outputs to the environment of society's needs. And we'll talk about air, water, and solid waste. And then we're going to learn how to kind of analyze the various outputs in a critical fashion. And then we'll develop a general understanding of how biomass resources and bioproducts can help us solve some of our waste management problems. Okay, the first thing to really appreciate is that everything we do impacts the environment. There's not one action that does not have some influence on the environment. Let's just take a very simple example. A house that we live in. On the surface, it doesn't look like there's a lot of outputs to the environment, but there really are. Think about what it takes to run a house and all of the different inputs. These can be chemicals, power, materials, other things. And basically, the wastes that we create are a lot and different. We've got solid wastes, we've got water pollution, and we have air pollution. The quantities can be significant. Let's just kind of look at some very interesting outputs of just a regular household or people. The first one is an impact of human health. When you think about it, the pharmaceuticals, the drugs that we use that have positives to keep us healthy, they also have very significant effects on the environment. Let's just talk about two of them. One of them would be things like birth control pills. What will happen is people will take birth control pills, and that will go through their system, but it'll end up in the water through natural bodily functions. And then that water will go back into the groundwater, back to wastewater treatment plants, and those pharmaceuticals can actually go through those processes and back into our drinking water and back into the environment. One example of how this can affect things is that there were fish in the Potomac River that were observed to change their sex based on the hormones that were secreted by pharmaceuticals. It could be very significant. Another example is BPA. People talk about bisphenol A plastics, and there's a lot of controversy about putting them in the microwave and if they will affect developmental disorders and birth defects and things like that. That's a very significant thing. Again, something that we use quite a bit. A lot of plastics have this BPA, and it impacts us and impacts the environment. Here's another output that you might not think about from your house. When you wash clothes, what happens is there's thousands and thousands of particles that come off the clothes in the washing machine and in the dryer. The ones that from the washing machine actually go out into the water, and they go into our they go back, and they're either processed by a wastewater treatment plant, or they go out into the environment themselves. Those particles actually are in the water, and fish actually mistake them for food, and they get ingested by the fish. And there's been a lot of studies that have seen significant amounts of these plastics or clothing fibers in the fish. Then we eat the fish, and there's problems for the environment and the ecosystems, the animals that eat the fish, and also humans that we also take in the fish. Here's just some data about how significant the problem is. This data we created in our labs, and basically what it says is that for different types of very common fibers used for making clothing, every cycle that we wash, there's continuously a removal of these microfibers into the environment. And so what this graph is showing that is for every wash through multiple cycles, every wash will give us about 0.1 milligram, 0.05 milligrams of material for every gram of fabric that we wash. If you look at the lawn drying, it's about the same, around 0.1 or so. So in total, every time you wash clothes, you lose about 0.2% by weight of those clothes into either the water or the air. Okay? Over 10 cycles, that's 2% of the weight of all your clothes that are going into the environment. Another thing that's very interesting about this is that those clothing fibers that are lost to the environment, they can be different. They can be either cotton or polyester, two of the most common types of fibers. And this graph right here shows what happens to those fibers when they go into the environment. So the fibers, let's just assume they end up in water, maybe in a lake or a river. And this graph right here is a careful study of how these materials biodegrade. What you can see is in about 250 days, the cotton biodegrades by about 76%. So what happens is this natural cotton fiber is reincorporated into the environment in a non-harmful way. Let's contrast that to polyester, a synthetic polymer. That polyester, after 250 days, only 4 or 5% of that polyester has been biodegraded. That plastic stays in the environment, and it can attract toxic chemicals and then be ingested by fish and other wildlife, and then again affect humans. So cotton, a bioproduct, has some serious advantages over polyester, a synthetic, non-renewable product, in the sense that it's environmentally compatible. All right, now we know that all our actions affect the environment. Now, the EPA is a U.S. federal government agency, and it's there to protect the environment. Before we had the EPA, we were doing things in a very thoughtless way. We were just dumping things into rivers and emitting things from furnaces without really much care. But the EPA has really been the leader for the federal government to say, okay, let's try to take care of our environment. The EPA talks about two different kinds of pollutions. A point source was the first one. The point source means that it just comes from one permanent location. So things like factories, a pipe, a smokestack, these are considered point sources. The other type of pollution is a non-point source. So these pollutions can come from things like automobiles, or from just in general land runoff, precipitation, drainage from lands and things like that. But it's not from, you can't really pinpoint it to one source. And these are much harder to deal with. One of the types of pollution that the EPA talks about is air pollution. Okay, and what the EPA had done was establish what's called the Clean Air Act, which sets standards for pollutants in order to try to keep the public health high. There are definitely some standards for things that really directly impact human health, primary standards, and then there are also secondary standards that are important for other types of public welfare, things like damage to animals, crops, and vegetation that are much harder to see. I think everybody has an appreciation of air pollution and its impact on our lives. Many schools now are having a flag system where they can put up the flag, and that would indicate if the air quality is good or unhealthy. And you can see these in weather reports in the evening news, especially in the summertime when these pollutants are very prominent. We have a great quality of life in the United States, but it comes at a cost. We use a lot of oil and other fossil fuels, and these fossil fuels emit pollutants to the environment, things that can cause health issues, acid rain, and particulates. So just kind of as an example how significant it can be, in 2010, just in the United States, there was 13,000 deaths, 10,000 hospitalizations, 20,000 heart attacks, attributed in some sense to coal, non-renewable, somewhat dirty fuel. Another example is in China, 366,000 deaths in 2013 from coal plants. Really hard to kind of understand how that happens, but it's very significant. The largest source of toxic air pollution is from fossil fuel used in transportation in the U.S. EPA has set up some quality air standards and has some principal pollutants that are called criteria air pollutants. Carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen dioxide, all these are very strongly regulated and have very significant environmental and human health impacts that we really care about. The different types of power and fuel sources that we use in different parts of the United States can impact our environment locally. So again, in Northwest, where there's hydroelectric and there's not a lot of emissions, that's a positive for our air quality. However, in the Southeast, or the Midwest or so, there's a lot of coal, and that's going to impact the environmental health of our air. Okay, another pollutant that's important is water pollution, and the EPA set up the Clean Water Act as a structure for kind of making rules to protect our waters. Where does water pollution come from? A lot of it comes from animal feeding operations, sewer overflows, water from industrial facilities, construction sites, and runoffs. All these things can sum up to cause pollution in our water. Now, first thing maybe we should talk about is, what is the water cycle? The natural water cycle is where we have rain, and that rain goes onto the land. And natural land, or non-urban land, has grasses, trees, and things like that kind of capture and collect the water and delay it from going back into the river. And that actually allows the water to kind of soak into the ground, replace the groundwater that's so important for us, and also it stays in the plants and the soils and keeps things healthy. What happens when we start to put an urban landscape onto that ground? Okay, so what happens is we put a lot of impervious surfaces, things like roads, concrete, buildings, things like that. Well, that's not going to retain the water. So when it rains, the condensation from the rain, it's going to hit these impervious places, and there's going to be a lot less water that goes into our groundwater, which is what we really depend on as one of our main sources for water. And so that runoff will go right into the river, and very quickly. And then that river will just empty out into the ocean or so. And what's happening is that we don't really have that same opportunity of holding the water in the landscape and allowing it to evaporate into the atmosphere and kind of replenish the water that we need to rain. So we get a lot of runoff very quickly, less water in our land, and then less rainwater too. So that can have significant effects. The other thing about the urban landscape is that the water pollution can occur when we have precipitation falling on areas like agriculture or areas like urban roads. So what happens with this is that the strong precipitation actually will take in, let's say, like from roads, it will take in oil and gas that's on the road, small particles of rubber and things like that, and and the rain will wash that out. And with all the impervious surfaces, it will go through sewers and roads and right back into our water. Another example is the water. If it rains real hard and we have agriculture with a lot of fertilizer or pesticides, there's going to be runoff from those agricultural activities, and that will also go into our rivers and our lakes. And what can happen, especially with the agricultural runoff, is that a lot of nutrients and fertilizer go into the water. What that will do is that will give nourishment to organisms in the water, and then we'll get these algal blooms. The algal blooms, maybe you've seen something like that. When you have a lake or a pond and it has too much fertilizer, that nutrient, what has done is it's promoted the growth of those algal material, that plant material. And what happens is when that plant material dies, organisms in the water eat that dead plant material, and when they do that, they consume oxygen. What will happen is that the organisms that are consuming all that algal material, the oxygen now is gone, and then fish and other wildlife that depend on the amount of oxygen in the water, they can die off. Very serious issue. And this picture right here just shows a pond in Florida, or lake in Florida, freshwater, and it has a serious algal bloom in it. Very difficult for fish and other animals to live in these things. Another source of water pollution that many people don't think about is that power generation consumes a lot of water. Basically, when you have a nuclear power plant or a coal plant, you need water as a cooling source. And so water is taken out of a river or lake or so, and then used in the process to cool down some of the processed water. In that case, what happens is the water is warmed up. When it's warm, it doesn't have as much oxygen in it, so that oxygen level is depleted. And then what happens is that the warmer water is sent back, can be sent back to the environment and cause like thermal pollution. In this sense, there was a statistic that said 20% of U.S. watersheds are experiencing water supply stress, and part of it is because of all this use of water. The other type of waste that we can talk about, we talked about air, now we talked about water, is solid waste. And typically what we think about is garbage generated from municipalities that is landfilled. It could be considered, then that's very, very significant. And then we also have waste from industry that's also important. Sometimes they go into private landfills or public landfills. And then the other kinds of waste that we have are hazardous wastes. Things that really have a direct impact on human health that we don't want to just haphazardly thrown away. So let's just talk about solid waste. In the United States, the statistic that we have from 2013 is about 254 million tons of municipal waste was generated per year. That's a lot. It's about a ton of trash per person or so. A little bit less. What you can see in that pie is that the solid waste is many different materials, including non-renewables and renewables. So you can see that there's plastics in there, metals and glass, and then you've got renewables like paper, yard trimmings, and wood. That all equals up to about 254 million tons. Of that, about 34% of that is actually recycled or composted. So not all the 254 million tons of trash goes into the landfills. It's more like 180 or so, 160. In 2013, just as an example, the paper, which is 27% of the landfill material, so it's about 80 million tons of material. Of that 80 million tons, almost 2/3 was recycled, a very interesting and significant impact overall to our landfill waste reductions. So let's just kind of have you think about differences that you can make in your house and your behaviors by diverting diverting waste away from landfills. So think about it, and I'd like you to just take a minute or so and write down as many as you can think of behaviors that you do that can reduce your solid waste impact. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance to think about how you divert waste. And I was thinking myself about different ways that we divert waste. The first one is reusing things. So instead of just using a plastic bag and just disposing of it, I try to reuse it in any way I possibly can, as many times as I can. So a lot of times, instead of getting a new bag for bringing lunch into work or containing some wet waste, I reuse the bag in some other way. Another example would be recycling. So we have a recycling bin in my house that takes glass, plastics, metals, paper. And really a nice change in my household has been that recycling bin fills up very, very quickly relative to the waste that we put in our garbage can that's going to landfill. And that's another one. You can think of other things that you might do, maybe composting. So there's a lot of food waste, and that food waste can be composted and make really good new healthy soils. So using composting to reduce food waste that goes to landfills is another great option that you might do. Another thing to think about is correct disposal of batteries and drugs, pharmaceuticals. It takes just a little bit of effort to kind of keep your batteries and pharmaceuticals to the side and bring them to the proper waste disposal facility. But it's important. It's really important for the environment. It's a little thing that everyone can do and really improve our environmental health. And the last thing I'd talk about is food wastage. In the United States, we waste more food than we eat. It's about 80% of our food is wasted. Well, you can strike that and just say a good proportion of the food is wasted, and it's much greater than 50%. So if you think about it, you can change your food eating habits. You can start to purchase amounts of food in smaller quantities in order to reduce waste. You can actually reduce the amount of materials and kind of come up with a systematic plan on how to effectively eat things so that things don't spoil in your refrigerator. That's really important. Another waste, okay, I'll just skip that. But I hope I have shown you that there's a lot of different things that you individually can do in your household to reduce waste. This is what we kind of want to do with solid waste. We want to have a shift. Previously, we had a lot of abundant raw materials and products were cheap, and nobody really thought about the environment. Now, the idea is that we want to minimize the waste any possible way we can. That makes sense. And what that means is we're going to use and reuse as much as possible and then recycle as much as it possibly makes sense. Let's just now talk about how biomass resources and using bioproducts can help us in our three different types of pollution. The first one that we can appreciate is solid waste. With bioproducts, because they're predominantly organic, we can convert those into soil through composting, or we can actually burn them and combust them, or use other processes to make fuels. That could be a very significant reduction in solid waste. One of the most incredible stories is actually recycling. And paper is a bioproduct, and paper can be recycled, and it is recycled in an incredible fashion to save on solid waste. The second thing that bioproducts can do is help us with our water pollution. If we use bioproducts and we find the value in those, then we're going to plant more areas that have forests and other types of agriculture. And what can happen is, let's just say we have a farmland, right? And what we can do is, if we have bioproducts and we can grow them in other different places, let's just say we grow the bioproducts in this green area. Well, that natural soil and the bioproducts that are grown there can act as a filter so that the runoff actually can be filtered and processed in this biomass growth area rather than go to a river or water. So the encouragement of making bioproducts and setting aside land for bioproducts can really help us in cleaning up and filtering water before it gets into the rivers and our drinking sites. The last one we can talk about is air pollution. Not only do plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere and generate oxygen, which is good, but using bioproducts like biofuels, like ethanol, can be cleaner burning sources of fuel and reduce the amount of particulates and harmful pollutants that go into our environment. So in this picture right here, we're showing ethanol being burnt, and you can just see a very clean flame here, right about here, okay? And that flame actually is burning very clean, and there's not a lot of particulates there. So that bioethanol, if we use it for energy or to transport, to move our cars, really can burn clean. If you contrast that to gasoline over here on the right, what you can see is that the container actually has a lot of black material there. And that black material, we call it soot or some just kind of particulates. And then also, if you see the flame, what you will notice if you can look closer, and I believe there's a video that you can look at to kind of appreciate this, you'll see that there's a lot of black smoke coming from this, which are harmful particulates that go into the environment and can harm us. So air pollution can be reduced by the promotion of bioethanol, which is a bioproduct. Okay, just kind of how to summarize. First thing I want to say is that everything we do impacts the environment. We took an example of a house and a household, a very simple one, and looked at there's lots of pollutants that come from the house and emissions that really can have a significant impact. The second thing we did was we reviewed kind of the three primary sources of pollution, air, water, and solid, that are defined by the EPA, and the EPA is trying to help us create standards and rules in order to minimize these impacts on the environment. And then finally, we talked about biomass resources and bioproducts, how they can mitigate water pollution, air pollution, and solid pollution if managed properly. And thank you for your attention.